Welcome to another episode of Pr0totype. This episode is called How Far We've Come. And maybe some OG homies will be able to place the background of today's podcast's image, but I gotta say, it's a little bit of a deep cut. If you were around the community in 2018 and 2019, you might remember Stormborn, an installment of the Project Nemesis project. Yeah, my naming conventions were interesting back then. But of course, you can say they're still interesting now if you've ever clicked on a Zerg unit in Cosmonarchy Brood War. Either way, this project essentially had, I think it was 6 or 7 new units total. There was the Legionnaire and the Hierophant, the Cyprian and the Shaman, the Vorvaling, as it was called back then, and the, it might have already been called Bactylisk, but I think back then it was called the Basilisk. We were still using lard names and wacky conventions and stuff. So yeah, I think those might have been the only units, right? I think the 7th unit ever added to Cosmonarchy Brood War back when it was called Project Hydra might have actually been the Wyvern, funnily enough. But either way, we're talking about going way back to dig this one out of the archives. This is actually a YouTube thumbnail, which is why it's so compressed, so enjoy that. However, this is Nemesis Stormborn, a screenshot of that map. It basically was a revision or remake of the Eye of the Storm mission, and it included actually some hostile Protoss later on, but you played as Tassadar, Phoenix, and Raynor from left to right, and you took on some rogue Zerg that had already been made Renegade or Headless or whatever you want to call it when it lost a Cerebrate in the briefing. That was actually established in the briefing of this mission. And then you would go on to have that one reclaimed by the Overmind midway through the game to show off its ability to control stuff. It was just sort of like a timed event, though. It wasn't very engaging in terms of gameplay. It's not like it did something to do that. But either way, it was interesting. And it was a lot of cool ideas and a very heavy script in terms of dialogue. So that was a bit of a misfire. But we got some interesting stuff out of it. So either way, we're looking now at how far we've come since the humble beginnings. And you can't even really call that the beginnings because Hydra had been around for, it started in 2017 in terms of development, but it had been released in some form since 2018. And there wasn't really a slew of new units per se. That was for Nemesis Omega, I think, my first actual new units, including some hero changes for the Patriot, which was Dugal's Valkyrie. Yeah, that's going way back. So some interesting thoughts arise when I think back to where we started this project from. And a lot of it was, me working with Necron back in the day, and then it was me working with iQuare, and then obviously Veek showed up at some point, and, we just kept building and building and building. But we did start from humble beginnings, and I've just been reflective lately. I guess I've had this introspective, reflective, wistful, nostalgic sort of thought process couple of these days in a row here. I was looking back at some of the campaign missions that I had made when I was still revising the original campaign to be playable in CMBW in Project Hydra. Right, that was that's what Cosmonarchy Brood War is known as from the past. But before we even were able to do any sort of like replay analysis and castovers and stuff that we eventually had, that have taken us to this point where now we're over 100 castovers deep in the PvP, like player versus player castover playlist. We're 5 tournaments in, gonna be finishing up one of them in this weekend, and then starting our 6th one a couple weeks later. Like, we've gone places since then, places I definitely didn't suspect we would go. And yet it's interesting in some ways to look back at that. So in this particular show, we'll be looking at the game state, the level design and maps, and the players, and sort of just musing on that and sort of reflecting on strategies that were, of the time and very popular and how they've sort of phased out. So we essentially have different arcs of Cosmonarchy Brood War development. One of them was, again, Project Hydra, when it was just supposed to be like campaign related stuff and the scale of the tech trees was fairly small. And then at some point, before we had actually made the name change, we had started to really heavily expand the tech trees themselves. At some point, we got the website online and had the tech map started. And, eventually we got to where we are now, where it's called something different, Cosmonarchy Brood War. It's got a name that is more reflective of what its current and future goals are. And essentially the onus of the impetus of the project has become a bit more competitive, which is not to say that we've completely abandoned single player and cooperative content. It's just that even within that content, it's more about like having a good grasp of RTS fundamentals. So it's really interesting to go look back at that and see like all the different things, how comparatively small the tech trees were, how we, went through phases of removing upgrades and researches. And, but before that, we had tried to extend upgrades to that you could get up to 10 levels of upgrades, and how laughable that made stuff. And like, that was actually one of the cases where we were trying to make upgrades less limited to further explore the different ideas within them and be like, okay, well, what happens when you take this mechanic to its, maybe not logical conclusion, but a grander conclusion, something where you allow it to be exaggerated. What does that teach us? What did we learn from that? And, invariably that ended up alongside some discussions with Askosi over on the Big Boys Table, which is a podcast we used to do fairly regularly back in the day. Like, that was stuff that eventually we decided, oh yeah, well, it kind of makes more sense to just axe them. So we removed them. We made it so that researches initially were locked behind acquiring certain structures. For example, you needed a science facility for your science vessels to cast Irradiate, but your science vessels did not require that. I can't remember what they required. I think they might have just required the control tower, as it was called back then. This is, again, before we started renaming a bunch of stuff. They may have already been Seraphs at the time. But either way, like, the Irradiate spell was locked behind the acquisition of a tech structure. And then eventually we were like, well, that still feels weird. Like, if you lose the tech structure, then your units become less powerful. And also, if you build the tech structure, but your opponent doesn't scout it, like, how much sense does that make? And all this stuff, right? And yeah, the mechanics themselves went through significant overhauls, right? Eventually, we ended up removing supply and allowing you to harvest Vespene straight from the geyser. And that eventually translated into capping your geyser being a tier 2 thing, generally speaking, which previously was obviously just a tier 1 thing that you would always do. But the initial impact of allowing you to harvest gas from the get-go, particularly since you didn't need to earmark so many minerals towards supply structures or units for the case of Zerg in the early stages of the game, it did allow a lot more flexibility with the builds. And it definitely allowed you to forego some of the mineral harvesting if you needed to get some gas early on. And that immediately had an interesting impact. Now, obviously, the game state itself wasn't as balanced as it is now back then. So there was definitely some stuff that you could do that was kind of cheesy, like the Nather core rushes and stuff that people would do. And, the maps themselves weren't as refined, that's for sure. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But the game state went through all of these phases of experimentation, right? We eventually tried to revise the economic model one more time, but after the initial push to allow you to harvest gas directly from the geyser. And from there was one additional revision that we felt that, like, this is when I made it so that workers didn't have acceleration anymore, and instead they would have, what would you call it, the standard movement, I guess you would call it, the normal movement, the non-air unit type movement. So that way they were more consistent, but they got slowed down for general movement and all this other stuff. So it was interesting in that sense, where we get a chance to really try out all these different models and see how they work. And we settled on the one that we got right now. And I'm feeling pretty good about that. That's not to say there's not going to be some lighter, lower scale revisions, like maybe tier 3 stuff generally gets a gas cost increase to further encourage you to, get these gas structures and cap your geysers in the first place. That could be stuff like, for example, a while ago I had added a gas cost to ultra cores so that they weren't just mineral dumps for Zerg, and that was one example of exactly that sort of methodology. So you might see stuff like that, where there's going to be units that end up costing less minerals but more gas. We've already started to see that happen with Terrans anyway, with units like the Silver Tongue. So it wouldn't surprise me if that ends up sweeping through the other races, so that you do end up having this incentive to get that gas. But we're also seeing evolutions in the map design, where now people are pushing forward all sorts of different ideas. I mean, for one, it goes without saying, the early stages of mapping in CMBW, and again, this is in Cosmonarchy Brood War, the sort of most recent arc of development, because I have to shock you guys and say Project Hydra originally it had this campaign focus. There weren't really melee maps people were making. Maybe they would just play like actually one of the first player versus player matches we ever had were on campaign missions that like refurbished campaign missions that had been made from the ground up. So I remember, for example, we would play. It was Folka and Ultralisks. These are two community members from the way back. Had started to fight against each other and form a rivalry as like fairly, reasonably high skilled players for that era, and it was just compelling because Folka would always rush Ultralisks, and it would be like this ridiculous, like, oh, I got to try to hold on and stuff. And, I think this might have been around the time where we had experimented with reducing or removing Protoss tech requirements. I think at the very least we had tried the idea of like, okay, you still need tech requirements for units, but not for buildings. So you still needed like the Cenotaph or Cybernetics core, as it was called then, to unlock Drakodons. But you didn't need like anything for the Stargate. So you could just go a Stargate opener if you wanted. That still is the case now in CMBW, but obviously the whole economy and the game state balancing and stuff has changed since then. So it's a bit different. So at least I distinctly remember early air rushes out of Folka. So, regardless of how he got there, that was something that he liked to do. And I remember it being on the 3v3 map that was the first Protoss mission. It had been revised such that you had like Phoenix was in the middle as his Antioch base, right? And then you had two Protoss players. And the conceit behind the project was essentially that every mission could be played co-optionally. And that's why it was called Project Hydra, is like, oh, the many heads. So you always had at least 2-player co-op. And in some missions, like the first Protoss mission and the first Terra mission, there was theoretically the room to have a third player, but it wouldn't always be that way. I didn't want it to be consistently that way, mostly because like that really constrains how you can't really make very small maps in the early stages of the campaign and like naturally scale up. And also because, sometimes I don't want you to have 3 players because maybe I want you to be completely outnumbered, and it's harder to do that and still have an FFA. I really liked my FFAs when I was making Project Hydra, and I still do, of course, but that meant that you couldn't have like a team FFA going on if you had 3 players, whereas you could do a 2v2v. Well, you could do a 4-way 2v2 FFA, but you could also do like 2v3v2 v1 or something like that. And you can't really do that if every mission has to have 3 human players. Anyway, that was essentially the idea. So the Protoss mission had this 3v3 setup where one Protoss player would be more established. I think I just gave them more resources in the player versus player version, and like more starting resources, more starting bank. And the other 2 players on either team would have the normal conventional start, but they'd be further apart. So you couldn't really rush them down as the more advantaged player. But I might have even reset it so that everybody had default starting conditions, actually, come to think of it. Either way, though, the map was constructed in an asymmetric fashion, but it was really compelling instantaneously how we got to see different ideas at play when people were playing these against other humans in the campaign missions, right? That was sort of the start of player versus player matches. And this is before we had replay support and all sorts of things. Eventually, we also had things like, shared units, and we mostly played 4v4 AI games or 3v3 AI games or whatever. We had these events called fraudarchies, which we still occasionally do even now. And it was essentially just, let's just come together and play some big FFAs or some big, mostly AI games, because I think we had some desync issues in FFAs that were specifically when human vision was a concern. And, funnily enough, we haven't exactly quashed all of that, but for the most part, it's a lot more stable, right? So that's something where the AI-centric games were definitely king back in like after the campaign map era, right? When we rebranded a Cosmonarchy Brood War, it was mostly AI-centric games, and it was pretty neat. I did a lot of AI castovers, so there's a lot of AI development and musings. I did a lot of birthday maps. I did a lot of this stuff. So this is back in like 2021, essentially. And then, again, we went over the different economic models and such, but it was really interesting to see how players would try to fight together against AI. And that obviously fueled map development and all sorts of other stuff. So I think we can probably talk a little bit about maps here. Old maps were terrible, particularly if they were meant to be 1v1 maps. I still remember the Mapping Starter Guide series that I did where I made the Underwood, and that is one of the worst maps, actually, that is currently available. I mean, like, where do you even expand to, bro? Like, there's no place to expand to. The spacing is all out of whack. Your resources face the center of the map, and the air rush distance is tiny. So it's very, very silly in that respect. But I also made other maps. Don't worry, it doesn't end there. I'm mostly going to be using my maps for this example, mostly because even though it's been so long ago, I don't want to like inadvertently impugn somebody's reputation as like. An example could be like Knight of the Realms old maps were generally not very good, but he did make Nitro Valley, and the core of that map, I've taken over development of it since, but the core of that map has been, like essentially unchanged, right? And it ends up being a fairly good map even to this day. Now, of course, there were a lot of revisions that happened more recently, but like the current Ascension 5 version of the map is still not terrible. Like it's not unplayable. So it's interesting to see how that's changed over time. And like some people got a swing and a hit, and other times they got swings and misses, right? So it's interesting to see that sort of thing. But generally speaking, all the old maps were super unsafe. Good luck getting past one base and actually like expanding. It was very attacker favored. So if you could put on early aggression at any point, then you were probably at least favored to distract your opponent long enough, and that led to very volatile games. Plus, the game state itself was very volatile at this time. This is before we, at various points, sometimes we still had we didn't have armor penetration, which kind of kicked in around the same time as the supply removal. But there's all sorts of stuff that happened there. And then, like it was just interesting to go back and look at some of those old maps recently. After work yesterday, I'm recording this on Shambler's birthday, the 18th of October. However, and of course, happy birthday to him. I already said all that stuff. So it's you know what? He gets immortalized in a podcast too. Why not? But the cool stuff was like I was looking through all these old maps and I was talking about like, holy shit, dude, some of these maps, man. Like I went back and saw Rest in Paradise, another map I made. Obviously, I went back and looked at Crossguard. It's like, how could you possibly take an expansion on these maps? So it's just interesting to clock that, like the improvement, right? I mean, we had the campaign missions, which weren't really designed in theory to be particularly safe or defensible or whatever, but also they were meant to be played versus AI, so it didn't matter as much. But even some of the campaign layouts were a little bit more understandable and compelling compared to the stuff that you had in the context of like, oh shit, yeah, here's my, here's my my melee map or something. It's more comparable in terms of like, oh, here's an obvious natural. Whereas some maps that I just name dropped there, like the Underwood especially, but also Sunstarved, also Crossguard, like they had really far expansions. Like good luck ever taking it, especially if you're like Zerg or something. So yeah, is it any wonder we had really volatile games? So yeah, since then we've definitely learned a lot. Like one of the things that I always go back to when it comes to map design these days, and providing feedback for new people who are or newer mappers or whatever. And I guess we haven't seen like first time mappers in a while actually, but Biddy B and the Shambler have continued to make maps, and I feel like they've progressively improved, not just in their willingness to try to do the manual tile placements, but also in their capacity for like understanding what the anatomy of a good map is, or what makes a map. Even if it's not good or bad, like even if you take away those value judgments, it's like, can I take a safe third or can I take a safe fourth, or like, maybe you don't want this map to allow for that sort of thing, right? So it's just one of those things to think about. So, either way, like we've leveled up our global understanding as a community, and then also leveled up our specific understanding on the granular case of like individual mappers have improved their ability to understand what might need to be done or what adjustments might need to be made. And I just think it's really cool, right? And Biddy B in particular, Ben Dabrski, he tried to essentially emulate layouts from working maps that were in the competitive pool, or like at one point were in ASL map pools and stuff, for the sake of figuring out like, okay, what is actually different about CMBW? Like, are things that you do in the Brood War mapping space too safe or too volatile or whatever because of some fundamental paradigm shift within CMBW? And then like, I would say generally speaking, a lot of stuff is the same, but a critical difference is definitely build space. And then also a lot of the maps for example, in the TVZ matchup, a lot of the considerations go into having maps where Mutalisks can go in and get damage and mix it up in the mineral lines. And in CMBW, you really wouldn't want to do that because like there's way more access to air in general. So that's just one of those things where it's like, no, actually having turret room is kind of required. And but there's also some other concessions you can make. Like, okay, it's kind of required, but you can also build it much more easily inside your mineral line. Your workers don't tiz out as nearly as much, so it ends up being a lot more beneficial there. So like maybe it's not as bad in some ways now, and like the meta is always evolving as always. So it's not something that I'm guaranteeing is like a problem per se, but that's like one example, right? So I always look at, for example, like a very easy thing to think about is, do my mineral line, like, are the backs of my resources, essentially where my workers are facing while they're harvesting, are my workers then facing like a map border? I ended up smashing my stop record button. If my workers are smashing their stop record button, no, if they're harvesting resources in the context of facing a map border, then they're going to be insulated against a lot of air units, right? I think that's actually really big. So to me, I think that's like one obvious thing that you can always look at is say, how many angles of attack are there? How many pathways are there, etc.? That can be kind of confusing or overwhelming to defend if they're in a critical location. But also, timings between bases. And then, if there's going to be air units, can they easily rotate around, or do they have to kind of fly over contested territory in order to pincer and attack different areas and just split off and be annoying? All of this stuff is pretty interesting and pretty neat, but definitely something that I think is worthwhile to take a look at. So these are general thoughts, general ideas about map design. And I definitely think that, obviously I said earlier, the meta is always evolving, but also the game state is always changing. Like we're always making adjustments and what we think are better balanced decisions and improving things and also discovering things that may or indeed be busted. Like I casted a very long TVT match that is going to go live on Friday. And in that match, one of the things that happens is we end up seeing, I won't spoil it, but there's a unit that we haven't seen and an ability that we haven't seen that much of. And it's like the first time we're really seeing that unit and that ability. And everybody had just assumed that unit was bad, and it's a tier 3 Terran unit, and both sides end up building it. And it's like, yeah, okay, well, this is interesting because now we're starting to see use cases for this stuff come up where people are trying it and they're finding success with it, or at least some success. And like, then there's a whole idea of an arms race of like, how do I counter that? Or how do I, respond to that or whatever? So that's the kind of thing to me that I think is really interesting because that's always going to happen in a competitive space anyway. But we're so far away from knowing if stuff is truly busted. We need to see it in practice, and we need to see like, okay, does it just seem overpowered or seem generally really powerful because people don't yet know how to respond to it? Or is there actually not really much of a response you can do, right? And usually I think a promising sign, and this is also true in the case that I'm deliberately not spoiling, so you guys check out that video when it comes out, is I think it's valuable to consider it from this perspective, right? Like, if the thing that we're talking about is powerful, but not very good at defeating itself, then usually you naturally are going to emerge into these situations where like you probably can't just build the one unit. You have to have some kind of supporting cast. And I think that ends up being the case for this case, right? It's like this particular unit doesn't do well against other units of its ilk, of its type. It has an obvious glaring weakness in that sense. So definitely something that needs to be thought of. And there's like natural balance levers that can be pulled to make it not completely unplayably bad, but also, balance it out a little bit if need be, right? So we're still exploring that sort of thing. I think it's really beautiful that we see that kind of stuff. So when it comes to the tournaments and all this other stuff, we just haven't seen that. But that brings me to the next sort of topic or subtopic within looking back on Cosmonarchy Brood War. I think it's really funny if you ever go back and watch some of those old school castovers. Like the very first castover is Kian against the Shambler. It's on Yin Yang. And they're finding out for the first time, like Anseals with Mavericks and stuff. And it's just that it's beautiful. Like they're both bennoing it up, spamming Mavericks. It's just amazing to watch. And even, I'm referencing Benno here. He actually hasn't spammed Mavericks in a while, but his first couple of games of CMVW and when he played in like the tournaments and stuff, he just spammed out the fucking Mavericks, man. He was really a big Maverick player. He loved that shit. And, like our first group was called the Territory, and it was Group A of Ascension 1. It was Mystery Meat. It was it 3 crowd? No, it was Mystery Meat. I know Benno was involved, and I think it was Nablime. Yeah. So it was that was the case, and it was just Terran on Terran action the whole way through, and it was beautiful because the first match we had, which was Nablime against Mystery Meat, the first Ascension match we actually have in the recordings, right, in the stream VODs, is it's on Crossguard, as a map I was just bad mouthing, and not for bad reason either. It was for good reason. It was not a very good map, but it did have diadems. Like, that shit's cool. We got to see diadems at our first match, and I just remember being in that moment, and Mesk was like, okay, it was kind of beautiful because I just remember how the first diadem was being constructed. This is even before they had feet, dude. This is a long time ago now, and I remember thinking to myself, holy shit, in our first match, we're going to see tier 3 Terran, and we're going to see this back and forth where diadems are being constructed in the middle by Mystery Meat, and he's like taking over that little central hill plateau thing, and how amazing is this? And then Mesk comes in with like just sort of, you know, taking it in stride, so to speak, and he's like, yeah, and now we have diadems, or ion cannon. They might have still been called ion cannons back then, and now we have the ion cannons being deployed. And it's like, the fact that you can say that matter-of-factly and like with the gravitas or the seriousness to be like, yeah, this is a normal thing, is just so awesome in a competitive context of player versus player action. In an RTS game, like, it's really cool that you can start deploying these what would be considered like super weapons in conventional RTS games, but that just is a thing that happens and you expect it. Like, I remember being in that moment and having to like recenter real quick because I was caught up in the epicness, right? The awe-inspiring aspect of that, where I was like, fuck yes, we made an RTS where you build fucking diadems, dude. Like, that's amazing. That's epic. So I had to sort of catch myself on that, because I remember as soon as Mess said it, like, so matter of fact, I was like, fuck yeah, man. Like, that's of course you would build the ion cannon. You don't want to be a loser, do you? Build the ion cannon. So yeah, it was pretty good stuff, man. That was even back when they still attacked air units. Holy shit. All right, anyway, one of the things that I think is worth sort of documenting in this round here, as we're exiting the old map and talking about the player, like how the players have improved, right? It's just, you get to see the meta evolve, but you get to see how players learn each other's tendencies. Like the way that Nablime is being very economic and passive and stuff, and how like Keen called him out on that in general as like, yeah, Nablime always does this shit. And it's just interesting to see that sort of thing. So I really like to see stuff like that. I think it's beautiful. I also think when we're considering from the perspective of like, you know, the player tendencies and how we're also creating rivalries. Like, unfortunately, it didn't come to pass because Scholar didn't end up making it to his elimination match. But I was thinking, if he beats Biddy B and then he goes over and moves on to fight the Shambler, and the Shambler beats him, like, that's the second time Shambler beats him in a playoff series. Now we've got a rivalry. Like, now Scholar fucking hates this guy. He's like, no, I got to get him. And you know, something we were already seeing is Nablime has now dispatched the Shambler 3-1 in both of the series they played. One was ZVZ, one was ZVT, Nablime being the T in this most recent one. And it's like, yeah, Shambler's having a hard time defeating him. Like, oh, okay. You know, he used to be the top dog. He's used to being at least top 2, you know, second place, tit for tat trading these tournaments. But now Mystery Meat's gotten the better of him in Ascension 3. And then Ascension 4, he didn't even make it to the grand final. Like, holy shit. So that's a pretty big deal. And I just love to see that sort of thing happening where, you know, sure, it's our little league stuff. You know, we don't have like the best players. We don't have the highest skill stuff. But when we get to see the Shambler, Nablime, maybe Keen if he continues to practice, and obviously Mystery Meat, we get to see players who are trying a gun for it in terms of skill. And we're seeing new people who I'm sure will be interested in competing in that sense. Like this guy, his username on Discord is Hamster. That's what he goes by, Hamster. And that might sound like a non-threatening creature, but he likes to play Zerg and he seems to be fairly competent. Like he can actually, you know, pressure and do stuff. And I think that's really cool. So I'm a fan. And I think, in fact, as I'm recording this, Nablime and Hamster are playing matches right now because Nablime was trying to get warmed up for fighting against Mystery Meat, as they have the one of the matches here coming up here. I believe it's the upper final, indeed. So this decides who goes to the grand final. That's obviously a very big deal. So last time, you know, Mystery Meat got him 3-0 in the grand final, but this is double elimination, baby. You know, you never know what's going to happen. So although if Mystery Meat somehow gets knocked down to the lower bracket here, which I'm not betting on. I think Nibelheim can take a map, but I'm not betting on that happening. As far as like Nibelheim taking the whole series, that's just funny to me because that's like if Mystery Meat gets knocked down, there is no hope for anybody else. Like, Shambler thinks that he can get to him, but he might not get the chance. You know what I mean? And then Keen, on the other hand, was like 3-0, and only one of those games looked close. I don't know if his understanding is gonna be snappy enough. I don't know if he's gonna catch up quick. But anyway, that's the kind of shit, right? This is where we're at now, right? Like we've extended all of these limits, including selection and having the extra height so that we can have as many height levels as we want. And we've made all these balance improvements. We've refined our map design. Like our next map pool is going to be fucking fire. And I don't use that term lightly because fire is the element of Ahmed. And the players themselves are leveling up their understanding of the meta, and they're, theory crafting different things, and they're testing those things. And yeah, it's good, man. It's real good. And that's the kind of thing that I just want to take a moment to linger on, I guess, is like the level of play that we have now achieved and the level of sort of like game that we've created it just feels like you don't get this experience anywhere else. I've played a lot of RTS games, right? And I'm obviously very excited and gung-ho about my own work. But this is the kind of game that I would really have wanted to play myself for like years ago. If you sat me in front of Cosmonarchy Brood War as like a kid or as a teenager, I would have been overjoyed. I would have sunk hundreds of hours into this shit, if not thousands. It's like, this is my kind of shit. So in many ways, I'm making it because it's something that I want to do. It's something that I want to exist. But I feel like the fact that people are interested in it, the fact that we're slowly building up this community of, or maybe not so slowly, in fact, building up this community of people who are interested, not just in playing or making maps or whatever, but competing in tournaments, and it's epic. I think that's really cool. So I'm a big fan of that. And not only that, but also like it has to be said, we're also making it better all the time. Like we're daring to dream of a fourth race now, right? The Askosi have been conceptualized. I talked a little bit about them in the last episode of Pr0totype. And not only that, but it's like, we keep getting these epic visual updates where Solstice comes in, remodels the Huracan, the Goliath, and all this other stuff. He's got the Quaslusk and Nathrakorian, and like they look a lot more consistent than the original graphics. Shout out to Five Nations for giving us those graphics. We data mined them, but they gave us their blessing and didn't fuck with us, which was nice. But shout out to them for creating those so that we could enjoy them and experience them, you could say. And I also think in general, it's pretty based, it's like, it's one of those things that I'm really appreciative of, that we had those placeholder assets for so long. But the fact that we're replacing them with new stuff, that's the money stuff right there, man. That's the really big stuff. So I'm looking forward to that. Just seeing that even, go even farther. And beyond all that, I mean, let's think about it, right? We've got more, bug fixes and improvements on the way. We've got, updates to the tile sets coming that will allow more freedom for mappers and such. I'm actually going to be streaming some development of that very thing pretty soon later today. And I just keep thinking of ways to make this shit better. And a lot of it is down to people reporting bugs or providing suggestions or playing the games and then giving me stuff to think about, right? And yeah, of course, some things are still going to be a little bit jank or busted. This is built in StarCraft 1 and it's got notoriously terrible code. And that is not an unfair, unearned impression that people have of it. It's definitely actually pretty bad. But there's some things that are good about it, some things that endure about it. And I'm very happy that we not only have we achieved the point that we're achieving now, it's just that we also have such an easy shot or an obvious continuation here where we're going to keep on doing it. We're going to keep on making epic. And I think that's worth it. So that's definitely an interesting situation to be in. I'll say that much. And that's where we go, right? That's where we wind up. So I guess in conclusion, thinking about how we're only making this stuff better, only getting more exciting, only getting more epic, and only continuing to make better content, better maps, better balance, and better tournaments, all I can say is prime time to get on board. If you've been watching from the sidelines or you've only just begun, I'd say start playing some games, start practicing, start beating that AI ass, and eventually you can start beating that human ass. Yes, beat the human ass. It's a good idea. And yeah, that's pretty much the end of this particular sort of topic, I guess you could say. The idea of going back over and looking at how far we've come and all the different things we used to have that we don't have anymore, all the stuff we didn't have but now do have. it wasn't comprehensive, but I hope it gave you a little bit of a taste of just how long this project has been in the making, and how, admittedly, how far we've come, obviously, based on the title of the podcast, but just in general, it's like, it was so long ago that I started this, and I had no idea it would turn into what it is now. And I'm very grateful for everybody's involvement. And I hope that you guys feel like sort of the obvious thing would be to say, well, of course I'd be involved in something this epic. But, it's still nice. It feels good to know that you guys are appreciative, that you guys are still hanging in there and still providing your testing and your impressions and all this other stuff. So, without further ado, I think it's a good idea to switch into the other sort of fan-sourced, community-driven aspect of this, which is indeed the coffee questions. And I guess that probably means this will be a bit of a shorter episode of Prototype, because it was more themed, it was more targeted, but also we only have a small handful of questions. In fact, we have the magic number. We have 3 questions here for you. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, if you donate to our coffee page, linked in the description, you yourself can post a question, and I, myself, will answer it once a week. And that's for the low price of sending me $3 every month. You get 4 questions a week, because I do 4 of these once a week. That's a pretty good value. That's like 3 questions answered and a bonus question. 1 for good luck, you could say. 1 so that it's not a 3, because oftentimes it's good to not have 3s. But if you have any 3s you don't want to have anymore, you can send them to me. I guess that's how it works. 3Crow, fittingly enough, is opening up our 3-question saga by saying, do a deep dive on your wishes and design for the Askosi UI elements. So, I mean, basically, as far as I can tell, what 3Crow is asking is some information on my thoughts for a design or architecture of, say, the ready room, which is where the briefing screen is, and I guess, like, any sort of splash art that might be in the background, the sort of, like, in Terran Ready Room, there's like all of the random terminals and stuff. The Protoss Ready Room has that view, presumably from some sort of orbital frigate or something, looking over a Protoss city in the distance, sort of like a map painting style or whatever. And then Zerg obviously is like inside some sort of hive construction. And so what would the Askosi Ready Room look like? And also, what would the Askosi in-game console look like? That's where the minimap is hosted by, bordered by, all that stuff. By the way, if you ever want some aids, you can just realize that the Protoss is like mostly custom console, as far as like it mostly original, like it's unique to the Protoss, but their Ready Room is literally the Terran Ready Room recolored. So that's pretty embarrassing. And the Zerg one is, in fact, the Terran stuff, including their console and their Ready Room, it's just like flesh added onto the UI from the Terran stuff, like the Terran terminals and stuff, or like the portrait holes, right? The slots where you put the portraits in for the briefing that they talk to you, and like the UI where the objectives are being held from and stuff. All of the borders, all of the UI there is literally just like, it's Zerg. It's got like flesh on top of it, but it's still the Terran stuff that it's built on top of, instead of being entirely custom. And I don't know if that's just because Blizzard was lazy, or if it was because they were intentionally trying to make it so that like the Zerg subsumed Terran stuff, because it's sort of like you're still using a human interface, like human technology to look at them or to control them or something. But it ended up feeling a little lame. I would definitely like to eventually revise that, give the Protoss their own UI entirely for the Ready Room, and give the Zerg their own UI for everything. But since we're talking about the Askosi, I'm guessing that's what he means by UI. He might also be talking about like score screen and stuff right at the end. That's the only other thing that I can think of that would be race-specific UI. I will say that one of the things that I want to provide as a general sort of idea for the Askosi in terms of their architecture or their visuals is I want like harsh angles. Like I want very angular design where it's like, you're going to see a lot of, I guess, like straight line they're called chamfers in terms of modeling terms, but it's basically a bevel that only has one segment. So it's sort of like a 45-degree angle or whatever. There's definitely going to be a decent amount of that going on in their general construction. And they're also going to have a lot of patterned, like cylindrical curve I guess, structures or whatever. Not exactly Tesla coil, but something similar to it in terms of or like the inside spindling of like a light bulb or whatever. Some stuff that's kind of like that. They're going to have those. They're going to have a lot of electricity related to their attacks and such. Like that's their version of an energy weapon, essentially. And they're not going to have the same, like, Terrans have kinetics and lasers. Askosi are going to have kinetics and lightning, and Protoss are essentially just plasma and antimatter, I guess. And so, like, Protoss are going to be completely different in that sense, whereas Zerg is, like, I guess, claws, appendages, whatever, and bones is a new one that I've tried to add with things like the Zarkaver core and the Gorger core and stuff. And then the other stuff they have is obviously like spores, right? So, and acid, I guess. Like they've got all sorts of biological things, and I think that's fine. So when you're thinking about like the kinds of projectiles that they're going to throw, or like methods of attack, that's definitely going to be one of them. And Terran obviously also has fire. I should add that. They've got so the Terrans have kinetics, fire, and lasers. And lasers might even be like fire or whatever. I don't know. Like you can kind of think of them that way, although they don't proc fire. Imagine if all laser weapons like Wraiths apply to polyodadhesive. GG, by the way. But no Ahmed planes yet. But it's interesting to think about what's the UI going to be. And I started talking about their weaponry and stuff because I think obviously whatever thematics end up emerging from the Askosi design should be at least hinted at, if not actively covered and communicated by their user interface, by their general approach to things, right? So they're going to like their metal and their implants and their, you could say, I guess, like reinforced alloys of things. So I definitely think there will be like angular sort of layers of, I think they call it a blade of armor. Hilariously, this is a deep cut. If you end up watching the custom campaign playthrough of Celestial Stories, there's a point where I'm losing my mind because the Hick voice character, I can't remember his name. There's no way I would remember his name ever in a million years. But that guy says a blade of armor. Like he pronounces ablative as if it's a blade of. And that just sent me because a blade of armor, dude. It's just an armor, but it's a blade made of armor. That's what it is. So like that's a measuring stick or something for armor. I don't know. Pretty good stuff. So I think there's probably going to be a lot of that. You could imagine it's sort of like if you ever look at like the Protoss plating icon, it's like the air armor upgrade by default in StarCraft 1, but we use it for like the mechanical units, or like the Drakadin actually has that as their armor icon instead of the ground armor, the icon that's used for the Zealot, which is just the helmet. By the way, we might end up looking into replacing those icons with something more fitting. At least the armor one, it seems a little, I mean, technically it's like not that medieval, but it seems a little too medieval, you know what I mean? And also, like none of the Protoss now the Protoss have like helmets and stuff, but like Zealots don't wear helmets. So why the fuck is there a helmet icon for, like, you know what I mean? Just, it seems like they reused that asset from Warcraft 2 or something, even though they didn't. So that's funny to me. Yeah, so anyway, the icon stuff and like the icons of the Protoss plating have like much more curved stuff as opposed to the 45-degree angle stuff I was talking about, but they kind of have like layers of armor. That's sort of what I'm thinking is going to be like all over the console. There's going to at least be like a section of the panel that'll have like a bunch of those blades or a bunch of those layers, and it'll be like that, right? Sort of like an array of those. And maybe that'll be like above the status panel or something, which is what shows your HP if you select one unit and stuff like that, your wireframe, your unit name, and that sort of thing. I think for their borders, like the borders around buttons that are interactable and such, I'd like to say we could do something like maybe a more stock steel pattern or something like that, like reinforced like color in terms of and generally like when it comes to the visual makeup of it, it would be comparable to steel, something like that, right? Where it's they've got their like brighter gray or bone white or something like that for the color of the metal reinforcements and such, and that might be like panels and stuff that are essentially holding up, acting as like a pedestal for the interactable buttons. That could be something to think about. I don't know if there would be too much negative space in such a UI where it makes the buttons feel too floaty, but that would be something I would like to explore. And I definitely think there would be, well, I guess what you could probably see is there would be the panels and the, array of layers of armor and stuff, and the reinforced panels of steel. And then I guess that the reinforced layers of steel or panels of steel might actually be really good for the background of the buttons. And then I was thinking just now, since I was talking about those cylindrical, like wires almost, right? Those curved wire patterns could actually be the backing of the buttons, and it could essentially be, like, oh, it's like supposed to be like powering electricity to the buttons, right? That could be kind of like an interesting way to indicate that and provide some flavor to the UI. So it adds a little bit more visual interest when you focus on it. Obviously, it's not really meant to be something that is super distracting. So we would have to, I guess, focus test that just by like putting a version of that up, and then if we get complaints about it, like, oh, okay, that's something to think about. But also, you have to remember that anytime there's something new, and something I've learned a lot from looking at, for example, the Huracan remake or the Goliath remake, it's like anytime there's something new and it's replacing something old, or it's in place of something else, like, the first version of the Askosi test or whatever is probably just going to be a recolored Terran UI or something, because that seems like the easiest way to just get a custom console in there so that we can know that, hey, our custom logic works for picking a new race's console. And then like we'll iterate on an actual overhaul and like new version of everything at that point, like later on. So definitely something that's pretty interesting. But yeah, that's definitely the case. I think we could probably see like their start buttons. So like the start buttons are all different for each race in the ready room. The Terran one is like that globe sort of hologram. The Zerg is a crystal for some reason, and the Protoss is also a crystal, but it's a different crystal. So I think the Askosi would probably be something like a sort of energy coil, right? Something similar to the Tesla coil that I was talking about earlier, but obviously they don't actually have Tesla coils because that's a different thing. They'll be like Tesla coils with a twist or something to make them feel maybe a bit more angular for the housing and stuff, to go back to their idea of like of appreciating the chamfer, the 45-degree angle. So that's going to be stuff for them for sure. I think that would make the most sense as like a start button if we're going to use that's assuming I don't know how feasible it would be to really overhaul the UI for the briefings, the ready rooms and stuff, but I think it would be worthwhile to maybe think about doing that and see what we can do as far as like improving that. But assuming we don't overhaul the UI entirely, that's probably what you can expect out of the Askosi ready room and the Askosi console. Layers of reinforced armor, if you want to call it that, right? And then the steel panels, like the gray, it would probably be gray if it's the backing of buttons, because that's supposed to be more faded. So as opposed to the bone white idea. And then that'll be, dotted around in smaller quantities for like general flourishes to almost like bolt together the console. Like the way that the minimap, like from the minimap side, there's like a dip downward for a lot where they cut down towards the status panel, and then they rise back up a little bit for the portrait, the menu button, and the buttons in general, the command card, right? And so like that dip down would probably be more harshly angular than the other races, and you'd also probably see like those bone white or off gray steel, like reinforced panels and stuff, bolting them together or holding them together or something, as like a way to show that that's something that will be echoed in the architecture and the design of their units and stuff. So you can definitely expect that. And yeah, I don't know, pretty cool stuff. I like questions like these because I've thought about this stuff, but I never really articulated it per se. I didn't necessarily write all these details down, and a lot of this is off the cuff thinking about it. But shout out to good old Pr0totype for making me think about it. Yeah, big surprise there. And appreciate your question as always. And of course, if maybe I didn't cover some specific UI thing. I guess the only other thing would be like, well, we don't have custom cursors in Brood War actually. So I was going to say maybe the custom cursor design, but no, there's no custom cursors. I guess that's something that we should look into doing at some point. But yeah, for now, I think that's probably bog standard is probably as good as you're going to get. So there you go. Hopefully that answers the question thoroughly enough. And thanks for your support. Moving on to Myrian, he asks, how do you plan on sourcing voice acting for the No Frauds Club's future products? So this is on the back of me leveraging roller skates and Escatu Mesk for voice acting the Terran tutorial alongside myself. We're still waiting on some new takes from roller skates, and I think Mesk, he sent me a retake, or a new take, I guess. It's not even a retake, it's just like a line that he missed, basically. So yeah, we're basically gearing up to get that tutorial released. I might release it with dummy voice acting while I wait for roller skates as retakes. I might just have like my dry run that I was using to populate the triggers and stuff. But either way, like that's coming along, and maybe that was on his mind because we were talking about that. I was mentioning that a little bit in different videos and streams and stuff, that we're like getting a little bit closer to having voice acting and all this other things. So I guess I could say I could go pretty granular for this. For Pagan, there actually will be voice acting. There will be transmissions, dialogue, whatever you want to call it. So it's going to have like a script, there's going to be there's going to be like unit responses or whatever. And I'm obviously going to need to make sure that since these are enemies you're facing in a variety of contexts, but also there's like a bunch of different times you might face them, since you might come back and they've been repopulated because you didn't root out all of their, frontal bases and stuff. Like in that kind of context, you definitely want to make sure that the AI or like the unit responses and stuff don't grate on the player by playing the same sort of transmissions over and over again. Obviously, you already have this in like the original Doom, but it's just like guttural sounds and stuff. It's not actual dialogue. In fact, Duke Nukem 3D has actual dialogue for the player character. And I actually haven't decided if Pagan is going to have dialogue for the player character. I think that every time my initial plan is that every time you are facing off against not really a boss encounter per se, but like an encounter that if you defeat it will complete a primary objective. If you pass this encounter, you'll probably be hearing dialogue through that. And then that voice that you were hearing is going to sort of add itself to the repertoire of characters you have to think on, because these voices are actually all the makers, the player characters, since they're pieces of you, right? So that's kind of interesting to think about from a narrative-driven standpoint or whatever. But essentially, Pagan will have voice acting, so that will be something that I have to think about. Now, Pagan is also really wacky and has a lot of variety in terms of the monster design and the kinds of things that you might hear, or like the kinds of characters that might be speaking. So I feel like I'll be able to get a lot of mileage out of just putting on some accents, putting on some voices, and doing a lot of audio editing after the fact. So like people are already a little bit surprised sometimes that like the Madrigal and the Aeon and the Anticathon and the whatever else are me, even though I think some of them are really obviously me, but like I've been working with the project for years, so it makes sense that maybe I would think that. There's definitely ones that are more obviously me. Like if you compare the Cyprian to the Cyclops or whatever the fuck, like that's more obviously me. I guess the Wyvern as well is another one that's very similar to those other two. And it's like, okay, well, you can't win them all, and I wasn't really trying to either. It's just like we wanted some sort of encapsulation of the character of the unit. Let's deploy it. And then, so one thing that won't change even in Pagan or in any of my other games is when I make a game and I'm working on voice acting, I'll just have me as all of the characters initially. And when I send it, like the way that the process that I do when I need voice acting, like when I was getting Mesk and Roller Skates to work on the first map of the Terran, or the first tutorial mission, right? The Terran tutorial mission. I sent them the script, the full script, so they could see everything. I sent them which character they were and like a brief description of the character and like the context of the situation. And usually, especially if the line was not meant to be delivered in a more standard way, there would be some instruction or some emotional direction, like with a sigh or with a heavy heart or trying to feign confidence or whatever. And then in addition to all of that textual stuff, there would actually be an example reading of all the lines. So you'd get one example of how I read the lines, where if you can't figure out a way to make it sound satisfying in your head, you can at least refer back to that, because that satisfied me enough to be saying basically like, you don't have to stick to this idea, but this is an idea to work off of. And I feel like providing them an example, whoever the voice actor is, and also the script and also all this direction, and then being able to communicate afterwards for retakes at the leisure of the voice actor is a pretty good way to comprehensively work on that sort of style. But it does mean that I have all of these sample takes, so I might as well use them. So I'll use the sample takes that I did for the sake of providing direction and information to the voice actor. And those will go into the game, and that will be what we have for by default. And whether or not that goes to a shipped build at any point is sort of irrelevant, because eventually it will be updated. Like I was saying earlier, that maybe the Terran tutorial ships without Roller Skates' voice acting for now, depending on how long it takes him to provide me with the new takes. Although I think he's been fairly quick about it, and he said it later on this week he would get to the retakes. So that's just an example of like, okay, well, if that was the last thing holding me back from releasing the map, I might not hold myself back from releasing the map, if you know what I mean. So I think that's pretty cool, for sure. And I think also in general, it's something to think about and keep in mind as we're going through the whole procedure and building out a bunch of improvements and changes and all this other stuff to how we do things like voice acting requisition. That's probably going to be fairly simple. Now, there was more to Myrian's question to add context to it, like things like talking about how even if you assume there's going to be enough people who have the voice acting chops and also the equipment to do high quality enough voice acting for whatever the circumstance may demand, and they're also willing to do it for free. And none of that is like a guarantee per se. It still sounds like it would be really challenging to do voice acting for all the different projects or in all the different contexts. And it's just going to be slow going. One thing that I am a little bit uncertain of, and one thing I've always been a little bit afraid of, is, for example, taking a character that could meaningfully have like sequels in the future that involve that character, and saying, okay, this is not going to be me. Because, who knows what happens? Like even somebody like Askosi who's been around for a long time, or like Pr0totype, or some of these people who have been around for years, and I've known for years, like they could get to a point where they simply can't do voice acting anymore for whatever reason, right? Like there could obviously be some sort of, like injury or something that they sustain, or they can't, their living conditions change and they can't do it. Like Mesk wasn't even sure he'd be able to voice act because he had to move somewhere. Like who knows what could happen where like, but at the same time, at this point, I've kind of come to accept like, okay, well, they're offering it now. I can at least make the content now and make the content that much better now. And if I have to recast them in the future, that's fine. Like it's not the end of the world. It's different if it's like, I'm building a campaign. I release like 5 out of 6 missions of a campaign, and then the 6th mission, I can't get the original voice actor. Well, then we would redo all of the lines of the new voice actor for all of the first 5 missions, just because that makes sense because it's within one campaign. But if it's like a year later, I'm building a sequel to that campaign or whatever, like, yeah, I don't really care that much. It's okay. We have to recast. I'm not going to go back and update the old one too, So at this point, I'm basically over that. I used to be a lot more concerned about that. But now it's more like, well, whatever, I'll do what I can myself. And then whatever is like sort of the lowest hanging fruit, or like the least convincing and the least distinct delivery from me is like, okay, that's the worst one basically. So that's the one that I want to replace highest quality or the most. And I think that's good. I think that's a positive thing. So hopefully that sheds some light on the process that we use to do the voice acting stuff. And I guess the only thing I can say is right now, I don't think that's going to change. I think we're only going to increase in profile and in notoriety. So people are going to continue to be interested in providing. Like, I know that a lot of people in the community would be interested in voice acting like enemies and Pagan or whatever, even though they, I wouldn't be able to compensate them. It's not a matter of not wanting to. I would love to be able to pay people that are in the community that I crowdsource or whatever, that I like discover and like coach up for the voice acting role and stuff. I just don't have that capital. If I did, things would be different. But if I had the money, I would absolutely be paying these people. Like, I'd be sending Knight of the Realm money for the Nitro Valley map to like sort of buy the map off of him, so to speak. But in a way to say like, hey, thanks for making a map. It's made some interesting games in Ascension for CMBW. Like, that's the level of stuff I would go to if I had just a bunch of money lying around. I would actually be trying to provide people payments for the work that they've done. That CMBW as a whole is weird to say profited from, but just like benefited from, right? I definitely think CMBW has benefited from Nitro Valley, and that's like one of the examples, right? And the Beaver's making maps, and Shambler's making maps, and Bittybee's making maps. And it's like, yeah, if I get, a map accepted into the pool, and it's used for tournament games, I think people should be rewarded for that. And maybe it's something silly like for every game played, you get another $1 on that map. But I don't know. I don't think that's really necessary. I think it's just like, hey, let me just send you like $20 or whatever for this map. Thanks a lot. Like little shit like that. Even stuff like that, I'm not currently able to do, but eventually I would love to be able to. And yeah, for voice acting, I think it would be the same way. Like, hey, Pr0totype voice acted the Matador, so like let me send him some money. And Beaver voice acted the Blackjack, let me send him some money. And then, Mesk voice acted all these units, I got to send him some money too. Like, if I had the money, I'd definitely be doing that. But, we're not there yet. But that's absolutely something that I would like to do. It's just a question of, is it practical to do in terms of the cash flow that I currently have? So I guess the long answer is, if you're worried about me not being able to pay voice actors or whatever, send more 3s my way. I don't know what else to say. But yeah, as far as Myrian's question goes, hopefully that answered it. And actually, Myrian did send me some more testing with like a homemade pop filter or something recently. So you might hear Myrian's voice in the project at some point, at least in CMW. We'll see about further developments later on. Who knows what can happen? But it would be great to have more Terran voices, right? Because there's only so many times you can listen to me before you start thinking, wait, is this guy everybody? And the answer is almost yes. The Shambler asks, if you had to make a city management game, how would you make it interesting? Well, happy birthday, Shambler. Second, let's read the rest of the context of this question. You can break the usual tropes of the genre as you please, so long as the game is still recognizable as a city management game and not an RTS or grand strategy game. A city management game. The problem is I haven't really played a lot of these. I think it was, oh man, what is it called? Let me quickly search up what game this was, because it was like Casino something. I got it, boys. It was Casino Empire. Yeah, what a game. I remember the Hoyle games. So they had like cards and they had Mahjong tiles, and then they had Casino Empire. And I was like, holy shit, this is based. This is like a Windows XP game, or at least a game I played on Windows XP. So that's a game I played as a wee lad. I appreciated certain aspects of it. I don't remember why I kept losing. I don't know if I would do a lot better now if I went back and looked at it. It's probably like Babby's first fucking casino game or something. But judging by how far I got into the game without really knowing what the fuck was going on. But it was, there was something satisfying about building like arrays of ATMs and shit, or like slot machines and stuff. And there was definitely something satisfying about like, oh, there's trash here, so let me hire some more janitors. And you just like click a spot and like a janitor would appear because you hired him. So of course he just appears right there and shit like that. And like that's more gamified than I guess most management games, but I've never played like SimCity. I've never played anything like that. So you're talking about City Manager. Yeah. I think that's like, as far as management style games go, I think that might be, I guess I played a little bit of Prison Architect with my brother in co-op, but that's a little bit different too. How would I go about building like it's his birthday, so I want to answer his question well, but I really have to think about this. If I had to make a city management game, how would I make it interesting? I think what I would do is I would have it be like a gag where like the city, so normally you're like managing a city I assume for the sake of like, hey, I really want to make it so that my population grows high and that businesses boom and the trains run on time and all this other stuff. I think what I would do is so the one thing I would take from Casino Empire is that like there'd be stages. So like you go to one city to sort of like manage that city. And in Casino Empire, you basically had that. So like the first casino you'd take over, it was sort of like, I guess Kitchen Nightmares or some other thing where it's like a failing business. Some specialty guy comes in, assesses the situation and fixes it. You're the specialty guy. So you go from failing casino to failing casino and try to like update stuff and make stuff work again. And yeah, that's definitely something that I think I'd go in and do. So you'd walk into a city and there'd be like a directive or whatever from the state government or the national government or whatever, and the federal government, I guess. And it's like, okay, here's the situation, right? Like, we need this stuff. And like, these are some of your goals that you can work towards in addition to general upkeep. But like the further you progress along the goals, the more obviously absurd they become. Like one of them might be to like grow your population to an absurd number that like just doesn't fit. And then like, once you hit that amount, even if everything else is falling apart, like there's riots and there's, overpopulation and disease and all this other shit. Once that happens, like the aliens come in and abduct the whole fucking population center and then they leave. So, and then you're like, all right, good job. On to the next one. It's like, what? That was victory? So shit like that is kind of funny. I would do, basically that would be the thrust of the game is you'd have city management, but you'd have to manage it into some like absurd end game situation at the end where at the end of every level, once you achieve your goal, it's like you start to learn, oh, it doesn't matter if I achieve my goal like for just a second, that still counts. And then like the aliens come to abduct them, or, we release the hounds, like the zoos are unleashed and then all the lions go through the city and then it's filmed for like some epic reality TV or there might be one that's like build enough, try to build as many like houses as possible, housing as few people as possible each or whatever, some different challenge. And then it's like a nuclear test or some shit. I don't know. There's all sorts of stuff that you could probably do to play around with stuff. Like, that's probably what I would do. So I guess that would be subverting the tropes, because I think normally you're supposed to just like stick with. Well, I don't know. I haven't played these games. I assume you normally stick with like one city as opposed to doing the stages thing. But even if you do the stages thing, one of the ideas is you try to make it so that the city is sort of self-managing, and like maybe it's one of those things where it's like you only win if you like remain above some certain statistic, or like certain line of like minimum standard for like 100 days, and that's supposed to indicate that you're sustainable, or whatever. Like that's just an example time. That's the kind of shit that I would do, though. I would just be like, no, just reach your goal by whatever means necessary. And there would be some strategy to that. Like you wouldn't just be able to do the one thing. Like you'd have to engage with general management mechanics, and then maybe like the more you progress, the more like wacky shit you can deploy or something. Like there's all sorts of cool ideas you could probably come up with there. So yeah, hopefully that gave you a laugh, and that is the city management game I would do. It's actually like city mismanagement. It's like deliberately fucking destroying yourself. So I guess that's how I'll close up this episode of Prototype, is talking about that Ahmed's management game, where you have to raise enough people and livestock so that you can turn them into Mikan for Ahmed to eat. I don't know. That sounds like a good game to me. Let's close this one out, boys. It's the show outro. We've talked about all the different stuff. We've wished Shambler a happy birthday. We've sort of been retrospective, right, and wistful and nostalgic, looking back at Stormborn and Hydra, and the humble beginnings where we first fucked around and stuff. I didn't really talk about it in Consummate, but I guess that was technically like the origin point of a lot of the ideas. Like I had building animations and stuff. Like the gateway actually blinked not as neatly and aesthetically pleasingly as DF's changed to the gateway, but it was one example where the gateway blinks when it's animating and stuff like that. So like, if you really want to go way back, that 2017 campaign would be one of them to look at. But yeah, it's cool. It's compelling. It's interesting. I'm really glad that Cosmonarchy Brood War has endured thus far to this level. And I'm really excited for the future, not just for CMBW, but for Pagan, for Onatar, Pangea, Zabalva, whatever the fuck. Just insert the thing that I will at one point be working on, or am currently working on. And I'm excited about it because I'm just an excitable individual. And thanks for sticking around for as long as you guys have, man. That, Shambler's obviously been around for years now, and it's his birthday, so it's topical. But like Myrian's now stuck around for at least a year, I think. He might have discovered us based on the No Frauds Club channel, if I'm not mistaken. Then Pr0totype I've just known him forever. So those homies, and then all the other homies that did not submit questions, and I'll do another quick check, make sure I didn't miss any. Yeah, looks good. Appreciate you guys, and let's keep on building the epic. Bye.